France fell in June of 1940. In just 6 weeks, Hitler's forces crushed one of Europe's greatest military powers. Across the Atlantic, the United States, still neutral, was watching closely. At the time, America was deeply isolationist. Most people wanted no part of another European war. World War I had ended only 2 decades earlier, and the wounds still hadn't fully healed. But as German tanks rolled through Paris and the Nazi threat grew, Americans started to feel uneasy. It was becoming clear the US might not be able to sit this one out, and if war was coming, the country needed to be ready. Problem was, it wasn't. In 1940, the US Army ranked 18th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. The military was undermanned, under-equipped, and underprepared for modern warfare. So, in a bold and historic move, Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. It was the first peacetime draft in American history. Signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on September 16th, it required all men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register for military service. How did it work? The draft was essentially a national lottery. Each registrant received a number, and those numbers were randomly drawn in Washington, D.C. Imagine it, the Secretary of War physically pulling numbers from a bowl while the president read them aloud, like a grim version of bingo. Once a number was selected, local draft boards across the country matched it to a man in their area. And just like that, he was in the Army. At first, draftees were only required to serve for 12 months, but that changed quickly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The US was now officially at war, and those 12 months, they stretched into years. As the war escalated, the draft expanded. The age range shifted to 18 to 45. By 1942, deferments for younger men were nearly impossible to get, and by the end of the war, more than 50 million men had registered and over 10 million were drafted into the armed forces. On paper, the draft was racially neutral, but in practice, discrimination was rampant. The US military was still segregated. Black Americans were often drafted later, placed in separate units, and assigned to labor or support roles rather than combat. It wasn't until 1943 that a racial quota system was introduced to ensure Black Americans were more fully represented in the armed forces. Once drafted, men were sent off to basic training or boot camp. This was where ordinary civilians were transformed into soldiers. The process was intense. Recruits had their heads shaved, were issued uniforms and equipment, and assigned serial numbers. The message was clear. You're not an individual anymore. You're part of a unit. Training included physical conditioning, weapons handling, drill, discipline, and endless repetition. Recruits learned to obey orders, follow procedure, and function as a team. Drill instructors, often battle-hardened veterans, ran the show. They barked orders, punished mistakes with extra duties or grueling exercises, and made sure the men were mentally tough enough to face the battlefield. After boot camp, soldiers often received specialized training. That could mean learning to operate a radio, drive a tank, shoot a machine gun, or conduct amphibious landings. Assignments were based partly on need and partly on a test called the Army General Classification Test, or AGCT. This test aimed to assess a soldier's skills and trainability. High scorers might be placed in technical or leadership roles. Low scorers, straight to the infantry. And the infantry, that was the most dangerous place to be. Infantrymen made up a relatively small portion of the military, but they took on the vast majority of casualties. They marched through mud, snow, and enemy fire, carrying everything they needed on their backs. A GI's gear typically included an M1 Garand rifle, over 10 pounds loaded, helmets, entrenching tools, and web gear. About 20 pounds of clothing, long underwear, wool pants, extra socks, heavy sweaters, overcoats, around 60 pounds of equipment, ammo, rations, grenades, blankets, mess kits, canteens, shaving kits, and sometimes gas masks. And of all these items, socks were considered one of the most important. Wet feet could lead to blisters, fungal infections, or even trench foot, which could disable a soldier for weeks or permanently. Clean, dry socks were a matter of survival. Hygiene in the field was a luxury. Many soldiers went weeks without bathing or changing clothes. If they were lucky, they could use a lister bag, a canvas water bag that dripped cold water from a spout like a field shower. Toothbrushes and razors were issued, but shaving and brushing your teeth weren't exactly top priorities when artillery was falling around you. Food? Forget hot meals. Most days, it was K rations, canned meat, crackers, powdered lemonade, chewing gum, instant coffee. Keeping morale high was a constant struggle. Infantry soldiers felt overworked, underpaid, and underappreciated. They faced constant danger, harsh conditions, and little recognition. That changed, thanks to Ernie Pyle, a beloved war correspondent who wrote about the daily hardships of frontline troops. Pyle's columns helped convince the Army to introduce combat pay in 1944. Soldiers who earned the Combat Infantryman badge received $10 more a month, about $175 in today's money. Still not a fortune, but it was a step toward fairness. Even with newspapers like Stars and Stripes, information at the front was scarce. Often, even officers didn't know the strategic purpose behind their mission. Soldiers were ordered to seize a hill or defend a village without knowing why, and that was just how it worked. As the war drew to a close, the Army faced a new challenge: what to do with millions of men now scattered across Europe and the Pacific. In late 1944, the US introduced the Adjusted Service Rating Score, better known as the point system. Soldiers earned points for time served, time overseas, combat campaigns, medals, and dependent children. You needed 85 points to be eligible for discharge, but even then, many waited months for transport back home. That's where Operation Magic Carpet came in, a massive post-war effort to return American troops to the States. Every ship available was used: carriers, transports, even cruise liners. By June 30th, 1947, demobilization was officially complete. Back home, GIs were celebrated as heroes, parades, cheering crowds. But many returning soldiers struggled to adjust. PTSD, though it wasn't called that yet, was widespread. Others feared they'd lost their jobs, their families, or their futures. To help, Congress passed the GI Bill, officially the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. It offered tuition, unemployment pay, and home loans. It helped millions of veterans rebuild their lives and reshaped post-war America. So, could you have made it as a World War II GI? Could you have handled the draft, the boot camp, the brutal conditions, and the uncertainty of combat? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories from the front lines of history, be sure to check out our next video. Because history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about people who lived it, fought through it, and came home to tell the story.